The radio crackled with static, then a voice, calm, authoritative, unmistakably Japanese. It ordered the garrison to stand down, every weapon to be laid at their feet, the white flag to be raised. And here's what made it impossible. The order was fake, completely fabricated, broadcast from a jury-rigged transmitter by 3 American intelligence officers who barely spoke the language. They convinced an entire island to surrender without firing a single shot. This is the story of how psychological warfare became more deadly than any bullet, and how one of the most audacious bluffs in military history unfolded in the Pacific Theater. The year was 1945. The Pacific War had become a brutal calculus of blood and time. Every island taken, every beachhead secured, came at a cost that ground commanders measured in body bags and Purple Hearts. The Japanese defenders had perfected a doctrine of resistance so fanatical, so deeply entrenched, that American planners faced a nightmare scenario with every approaching landfall. Iwo Jima had just concluded. Okinawa was still churning through lives like a thresher through wheat. The Pentagon brass knew that a mainland invasion of Japan would produce casualties that made the European theater look like a skirmish. But there were still dozens of bypassed garrisons scattered across the Pacific. Islands that had been cut off from supply lines, left to wither on the vine while the American advance pushed westward. Command had deemed them strategically irrelevant. Let them starve. Let them rot. Except these garrisons didn't rot quietly. They still had ammunition. They still had fighters willing to die for the Emperor. And they still posed a threat to air routes, to supply convoys, to the mop-up operations that would be necessary once Japan capitulated. One such island sat in the Marianas Chain. Its name has been lost to classification and time, but the men who were there remember it as Target 17. The designation was clinical, impersonal, just another grid reference on a map that covered half the ocean. Intelligence estimates put the garrison strength at somewhere between 400 and 600 men, dug in, fortified, equipped with coastal artillery that could shred any landing craft foolish enough to approach. A traditional assault would cost American lives. Maybe 100, maybe more. And for what? An island that didn't matter anymore. A footnote to a war that was already won in all but the final signature. That's when Captain Richard Holloway entered the picture. He wasn't a combat officer in the traditional sense. No infantry command, no tank platoons. Holloway was an intelligence specialist attached to Psychological Warfare Division, a former professor of linguistics from Berkeley who'd been pulled into uniform because he had a gift for understanding how people thought, how they communicated, how they broke. Holloway had spent 2 years studying captured Japanese documents, diaries, letters, field manuals. He'd interviewed prisoners when they could be convinced to talk. He'd dissected the command structure, the communication protocols, the precise formal language that Japanese officers used when issuing orders. He understood that the Japanese military operated on a rigid hierarchy where orders from superiors were treated as sacred, absolute, unquestionable. And he had an idea that sounded absolutely insane. He walked into the operations tent, where Colonel Marcus Webb was reviewing casualty projections for Target 17. Webb was old-school Marine Corps, a man who'd earned his rank through 20 years of service that included Belleau Wood in the First War. He didn't have much patience for ivory tower types, but he also didn't have much appetite for watching more boys die taking an island that would be forgotten by history before the year was out. Holloway spread a map across the planning table. He pointed to Target 17. Then he made his pitch. Don't invade. Don't bombard. Don't land a single Marine. Instead, broadcast a surrender order directly to the garrison. Make them believe it came from Tokyo, from Imperial headquarters itself. Use their own command structure against them. Exploit the one thing that defined the Japanese military more than courage or fanaticism: obedience. Webb stared at him like he'd suggested they ask the enemy politely to go home. The logistics alone seemed impossible. They'd need to replicate the exact radio frequencies the Japanese used. They'd need the correct call signs, the proper authentication codes. And even if they could fake all that, they'd need someone who could speak Japanese with the formal precision of a staff officer. One mispronounced word, one incorrect honorific, and the entire deception would collapse. Worse than collapse, it would alert the garrison that Americans were trying to infiltrate their communications, and they'd change everything. Holloway had answers for all of it. He'd captured a Japanese radio operator 3 months earlier on Saipan. The man had been carrying a code book, current frequencies, authentication procedures, everything they needed. As for the language, Holloway had been working with 2 Nisei interpreters, second-generation Japanese Americans whose parents had immigrated before the war, Thomas Yamada and James Nakamura. Both had been born in California. Both had enlisted despite the internment camps, despite everything their families had endured. They spoke Japanese like natives because it had been their first language, learned at their mother's knees before English ever entered the picture. Webb lit a cigarette and thought about it. The plan violated every conventional doctrine of warfare. It was duplicitous. It was underhanded. It was exactly the kind of trick that would get a man court-martialed if it failed. But if it worked, if it actually worked, it would save American lives. Maybe 100 of them, maybe more. And wasn't that worth any amount of deception? He gave Holloway 72 hours to make it happen. The technical challenges were staggering. The radio equipment available to American forces in 1945 was robust, but not particularly sophisticated. Replicating the exact frequency signature of a Japanese military transmission required modifications that Army radio technicians had never attempted. They pulled components from 3 different sets, rewired transformers, adjusted oscillators by hand, while monitoring the output on equipment that had been designed for entirely different purposes. The margin for error was microscopic. Yamada and Nakamura spent 2 days rehearsing the script Holloway had written. It had to sound natural, unrushed, the verbal equivalent of an official military document. Japanese military language operated on layers of formality that didn't translate well to English. A superior addressing a subordinate used different verb forms than a subordinate addressing a superior. The emperor was referenced through specific honorifics that changed depending on context. Get any of it wrong, and the whole performance would sound like a bad theater production. They practiced the timing, the pauses, the tone of voice that conveyed authority without emotion. Yamada would deliver the primary message. Nakamura would serve as backup in case Yamada's voice faltered or if technical difficulties required a second transmission. They recorded themselves and played it back. Again and again. Holloway sat with his eyes closed, listening not to the words but to the music of the language, the rhythm, the cadence, searching for anything that sounded off. On the 3rd night, they were ready. The transmission site was a hilltop on Tinian, far enough from the airfield that engine noise wouldn't contaminate the broadcast. They set up the equipment in a canvas tent that rippled and snapped in the tropical wind. The air smelled like rain and aviation fuel. Yamada sat in front of the microphone with a handwritten script on his lap. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what they were attempting. If this worked, it would save lives. If it failed, men would die anyway, and he'd have accomplished nothing except maybe alerting the enemy that their communications were compromised. Holloway checked his watch. The transmission window was narrow. Intelligence had identified a 30-minute period when the garrison on Target 17 routinely monitored their command frequency for updates from higher headquarters. Miss that window, and they'd have to wait another 24 hours. Try too many times, and the garrison might become suspicious. At exactly 2100 hours, Holloway gave the signal. Yamada keyed the microphone. His voice emerged steady and cold, formal, distant. He identified himself using the call sign for 31st Army Headquarters in Saipan, a headquarters that had ceased to exist months earlier when American forces overran the island, but which the bypassed garrison wouldn't know had fallen. He delivered the message with perfect diction. Orders from Imperial Headquarters. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. To preserve the lives of loyal soldiers for future service to the Emperor, all garrisons in the Marianas sector are to cease hostilities immediately. Lay down arms. Display white flags. American forces will accept your surrender with honor intact. Resistance serves no purpose. The Emperor himself has spoken. The transmission lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, Yamada released the microphone key and exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath underwater. The tent fell silent, except for the wind and the distant drone of a B-29 warming up on the runway below. Now came the waiting. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. American reconnaissance aircraft overflew Target 17 the next morning. Pilots reported no change, no white flags, no visible activity. The garrison seemed to be continuing normal operations. Webb called Holloway into his office and asked if they should start planning for an actual invasion. Holloway asked for patience. Radio communications in the Japanese military didn't work like American systems. Messages required confirmation, deliberation. The garrison commander would need to verify the order through whatever channels he still had available. That took time. 24 hours passed, then 48. On the 3rd day, a Navy patrol boat conducting a routine sweep off Target 17's coast reported something extraordinary. White sheets were hanging from trees visible above the beach, not one or two, but dozens. And on the highest point of the island, where the garrison had maintained an observation post, a white flag the size of a bedsheet flapped in the wind. Webb scrambled a reconnaissance team. A dozen Marines loaded into Higgins' boats with orders to approach cautiously, weapons ready, expecting a trap, because this couldn't possibly be real. No garrison surrendered based on a radio message. It violated everything commanders had learned about Japanese military culture over 4 years of brutal island fighting. The boats grounded on the beach. Marines advanced with rifles raised, and then Japanese soldiers began emerging from the tree line. No weapons, hands visible. Officers at the front, enlisted men behind, moving slowly, deliberately. Their uniforms were faded and patched. They looked thin, exhausted, but they were surrendering. Actually surrendering, the garrison commander was a captain named Takahashi. He approached the senior Marine officer with a formal letter written in careful Japanese script. Through an interpreter, the letter explained that he was complying with orders received from Imperial headquarters via radio transmission. He requested that his men be treated according to the rules of war, that their surrender be recorded as compliance with legitimate orders, not as an act of cowardice or betrayal. 417 men laid down their weapons on that beach. Not one shot was fired, not one casualty on either side. The Marines secured the island in less than 3 hours. They found stockpiles of ammunition that would have made an assault extremely costly. Defensive positions that had been prepared with the kind of meticulous care that defined Japanese military engineering. Machine gun nests with overlapping fields of fire. Mortar pits pre-registered on every likely landing zone. Taking that island by force would have been a bloodbath. Instead, it fell to a 90-second radio transmission and 3 men who understood that warfare wasn't just about firepower, it was about understanding the enemy's mind. The operation remained classified for decades. Holloway received a commendation that he couldn't talk about. Yamada and Nakamura went back to their units and finished the war without fanfare. The official record listed Target 17 as secured without opposition, which was technically true but missed the entire story. Webb retired after the war and never spoke about it publicly, but he kept a photograph on his desk, a picture of that beach with 400 Japanese soldiers standing in neat ranks, disarmed, waiting to be processed as prisoners. He'd saved 100 American lives, maybe more, and nobody outside a handful of classified briefings would ever know how. But the story didn't end with Target 17. The success of that operation changed how Psychological Warfare Division approached the endgame of the Pacific War. If one garrison could be convinced to surrender through fake communications, maybe others could too. Holloway's team began a systematic campaign. They identified bypassed Japanese positions throughout the Marianas and Carolines, small islands, isolated garrisons, places where men were cut off and running low on everything except the will to die fighting. The broadcast became more sophisticated. Holloway brought in additional Nisei linguists. They studied the personal backgrounds of garrison commanders when intelligence could identify them. They crafted messages that spoke to honor, to duty, to the idea that surrender under orders wasn't shameful. It was obedience, the supreme virtue of the Japanese soldier. Some broadcasts failed. Some garrisons ignored the transmissions or recognized them as fake, but others succeeded. In the final months of the war, at least 6 more Japanese garrisons surrendered based on fake radio orders. Thousands of men who would have fought to the death instead laid down their weapons. Thousands more American soldiers didn't have to storm those beaches. The ethical implications were complicated. Was it deception? Absolutely. Did it violate some unspoken rule of honorable warfare? Probably. But war itself was the ultimate violation of honor, and if trickery could replace bloodshed, Holloway considered that a trade worth making. He'd studied philosophy before the war. He understood the arguments about just means and unjust ends. But he'd also walked through field hospitals and seen what high explosives did to 18-year-old boys. He'd read letters from mothers asking why their sons had to die, taking islands that didn't even appear on most maps. Given the choice between deception and death, he chose deception every time. After Japan's formal surrender in August 1945, the true scope of the psychological warfare campaign began to emerge. Intelligence officers interviewed captured Japanese soldiers about how they'd made their decisions, about what had convinced them to surrender when their training and culture demanded they fight to the last man. The answers were revealing. Many genuinely believed the radio transmissions had been legitimate. They'd heard the formal language, the correct call signs, the proper authentication codes. They'd assumed their superiors in Tokyo had made a rational decision to preserve lives once the war became unwinnable. Others admitted they'd had doubts, suspicions, but the orders had provided an escape route from an impossible situation, a way to surrender without shame, without betraying the emperor or dishonoring their families. The fake radio messages had given them permission to do what they already knew was necessary, to stop fighting a war that was already lost. Captain Takahashi, the commander who'd surrendered Target 17, was interviewed extensively during his time as a POW. He admitted that he'd questioned whether the radio transmission was authentic. The timing seemed suspicious. The language was correct, but perhaps too perfect. But he'd been watching his men starve. He'd been rationing ammunition that would last maybe 2 more weeks of sustained combat. He'd known that resistance was futile. The radio message had simply provided a framework for accepting reality. He was asked if he felt betrayed when he learned the transmission had been fake. His answer, translated carefully by the interpreter, was this: "I felt relief, because it meant the war was ending, not because we were weak, but because someone was clever enough to find a way to stop the killing." Prow. Holloway never met Takahashi face to face, but he kept that quote in a notebook for the rest of his life. The men who executed these operations went home after the war and tried to return to normal lives. Holloway went back to Berkeley and resumed teaching linguistics. He never told his students what he'd done during the war. It remained classified for decades, and even after declassification, he felt uncomfortable discussing it. When colleagues asked about his service, he'd say he'd done intelligence work in the Pacific, translation, analysis, nothing exciting. Thomas Yamada returned to California and found that his parents' farm had been sold while they were interned. The land his grandfather had cleared and his father had worked for 30 years was gone. He used his GI Bill benefits to study engineering, built a career, raised a family. His children knew he'd served in the war, but he never spoke about what he'd actually done until late in his life, when a researcher from the National Archives tracked him down and asked for an interview. That interview is now preserved in the Library of Congress. His voice on the recording is quiet, thoughtful. He talks about the strange guilt of saving lives through deception, about whether he'd dishonored the soldiers who'd believed him, whether he'd betrayed something essential about his Japanese heritage by using the language of his ancestors as a weapon. The researcher asked if he'd do it again, knowing what he knew now. Yamada thought about it for a long time. Then he said yes, because the alternative was more men dying for no reason. And that would have been worse. James Nakamura was killed in a training accident in 1946, just months before his scheduled discharge. A truck collision on a base in California. He never got to go home. His role in the psychological warfare operations remained classified, so his family never knew that he'd helped save hundreds of lives without firing a shot. They buried him with full military honors in a cemetery outside Sacramento. Years later, when the operations were declassified, a small plaque was added to his grave marker. It noted his service with Psychological Warfare Division. It didn't explain what that meant. Colonel Webb retired to Virginia and spent his remaining years fishing the Rappahannock River. He died in 1963. In his personal papers, donated to the Marine Corps Archives after his death, was a single-page typed document, a brief account of Target 17. He'd written it for himself, not for publication. The final paragraph read, "We are taught that war is won through courage and firepower, but sometimes it is won through understanding the enemy's heart, through knowing that even warriors want permission to stop being warriors. I am proud of what we did. I am proud that I brought my boys home." The fake radio transmissions on Target 17 and the subsequent operations were part of a larger strategy that Intelligence Division had been refining throughout the Pacific War. But they represented something unique, the idea that you could win a battle without fighting it. That psychological pressure, applied with precision and understanding, could achieve what bombs and bullets could not. Modern military doctrine has absorbed these lessons. Psychological operations are now a standard component of warfare. Every conflict involves information warfare, disinformation campaigns, efforts to undermine enemy morale through targeted messaging. But those techniques trace their lineage back to men like Holloway, Yamada, and Nakamura, to a canvas tent on a hilltop in Tinian, where 3 Americans convinced an island to surrender using nothing but words and understanding. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The broader strategic implications of the fake radio operations went beyond individual islands. As intelligence assessments circulated through Pacific Command in mid-1945, planners began considering whether similar psychological tactics could be employed in the event of a mainland Japan invasion. The idea was both promising and deeply troubling. If radio deception could convince isolated garrisons to surrender, could it work on a larger scale? Could fake orders from imperial headquarters persuade entire divisions to stand down? The answer, according to analysts who studied Japanese military culture, was probably not. The mainland was different, communications were better, verification systems were stronger, and the ideological commitment to defending the home islands ran deeper than anything encountered in the bypass Pacific garrisons. Men who might surrender on a forgotten island after months of starvation would fight with absolute desperation on Japanese soil. The psychological conditions were fundamentally different, but the question became moot in August when atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the emperor himself broadcast the surrender announcement. That broadcast, the Jewel Voice broadcast as it became known, accomplished what no amount of tactical deception could have achieved. It gave millions of Japanese soldiers permission to stop fighting. It reframed surrender not as defeat, but as obedience to the ultimate authority. In that sense, Holloway's operations on Target 17 and elsewhere had anticipated the psychological mechanism that would end the entire war. The men who'd surrendered on those bypassed islands were eventually repatriated to Japan after the war ended. Their fate in post-war Japanese society was complicated. Some were welcomed home as men who'd done their duty under impossible circumstances. Others faced suspicion and shame for having surrendered, even under orders. Japanese military culture struggled to absorb the reality that thousands of soldiers had laid down arms while the war was still ongoing. It challenged narratives about Japanese fighting spirit and the warrior code. Captain Takahashi returned to his hometown near Osaka and tried to resume his pre-war life as a schoolteacher. He found that people asked uncomfortable questions. Why had his garrison surrendered? How had they received orders from headquarters that no longer existed? Had he verified the authenticity of those orders before complying? The implication was always there. Had he been tricked, or had he wanted an excuse to quit fighting? Years later, in the 1960s, Takahashi gave an interview to a Japanese historian documenting the final year of the war. He spoke candidly about Target 17, about hearing that radio transmission and wanting to believe it was real because the alternative was watching more of his men die from starvation and disease, about the relief when they marched out to surrender and weren't met with machine gun fire, about learning afterward that the orders had been fake and realizing he'd been outmaneuvered by an enemy who understood him better than he'd understood himself. The historian asked if he felt he'd failed in his duty. Takahashi's answer was measured. He said he'd fulfilled his duty to keep his men alive when continuation of combat served no military purpose. He said that blind obedience to doctrine was easier than making difficult decisions in ambiguous circumstances. And he said that if the Americans had been clever enough to exploit his desire to save his men, then they'd earned their victory through superior intelligence, not superior force. That interview was published in a small academic journal and largely forgotten. But it represents one of the few first-hand accounts from the Japanese perspective about how psychological warfare operations affected decision-making at the tactical level. Back in the United States, the psychological warfare techniques developed in the Pacific influenced post-war military doctrine. The newly created Central Intelligence Agency absorbed many of the officers and linguists who'd worked in psychological warfare division during the conflict. The lessons learned about manipulating enemy communications and exploiting cultural understanding became foundational to Cold War intelligence operations. Holloway himself was recruited to consult for the CIA in the early 1950s. He declined. He told the recruitment officer that he'd done his part in one war and had no interest in spending his life perfecting the art of deception. He'd seen what it cost the men who executed those operations. The moral weight, the ambiguity. He wanted to go back to teaching linguistics and let someone else figure out how to lie effectively in the next conflict. But he did write a classified paper in 1952 about the ethics of psychological operations. It was finally declassified in 2008. In it, he argued that deception in warfare was morally permissible when it reduced casualties on both sides, that the goal should always be to achieve strategic objectives with minimum loss of life. That honor in war wasn't about fighting openly, it was about ending the fighting as quickly and humanely as possible. He acknowledged the counter-arguments, that deception eroded trust and might make future conflicts more difficult to resolve, that it violated traditional codes of military honor, but he concluded that saving lives outweighed those concerns. The paper ended with a reflection on Target 17. He wrote, We lied to those men. We exploited their obedience and their cultural values. We tricked them into surrendering when their training told them to fight, and I would do it again without hesitation, because the alternative was a beach soaked in blood, American and Japanese. If that makes me dishonorable, then I accept that judgment. But I will not apologize for choosing life over death. That paper became required reading at intelligence training facilities for decades. Some instructors praised it as a clear-eyed assessment of moral complexity in warfare. Others criticized it as a rationalization for unethical tactics. But nobody disputed its fundamental point, that warfare constantly forces choices between competing values, and that the cleanest hands are often on the sidelines. The radio equipment used for the Target 17 operation was packed up and shipped back to the States after the war. Most of it was surplus and eventually sold off or scrapped. But the modified transmitter that Yamada had used for the fake broadcast ended up in the Smithsonian Institution's collection of World War II artifacts. It sits in a storage facility in Maryland now, tagged and cataloged, surrounded by thousands of other items from the war. A placard describes its technical specifications and notes that it was used for psychological warfare operations in the Pacific Theater. The full story isn't told because space is limited and context is complicated. But that transmitter represents something important. It's physical evidence that warfare isn't just kinetic, that the most decisive weapons aren't always the ones that explode, that understanding human psychology and culture can be more powerful than any amount of firepower. 3 men spoke into that transmitter for 90 seconds, and an island surrendered. That's a kind of power that's both awesome and unsettling. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The families of the men who died in the Pacific War never knew how many lives might have been saved by operations like Target 17. The soldiers who didn't have to assault that island went home and lived normal lives. They got jobs and married and raised children. They probably never thought about the island they didn't have to invade, the battle they didn't have to fight, the risks they didn't have to take. That's the strange mathematics of prevented casualties. You can count the men who died, but you can't count the men who didn't die because something didn't happen. The absence of tragedy doesn't leave monuments or medals. It just leaves silence. People living lives they might not have lived if different decisions had been made. Webb understood this in a way most combat officers didn't. He'd commanded men in battle. He'd written letters to families explaining that their sons had died taking objectives of marginal strategic value. He'd made the calculations, this many lives to achieve this objective, and had lived with the weight of those decisions. When Holloway pitched the fake radio operation, Webb saw it as a chance to drive different mathematics, to subtract casualties rather than add them, to win by not fighting. The Marine Corps awarded him a Legion of Merit for the operation. The citation was vague, something about exceptional intelligence work in the Marianas. Nobody reading it would understand what he'd actually done, but Webb didn't care about recognition. He cared about the 100 or so Marines who didn't die on a beach because he'd authorized an operation that violated every traditional concept of military honor. He kept a list of those Marines, not their names. He didn't know who specifically would have been assigned to assault Target 17 if the operation had gone forward, but he kept track of the units that would have been committed. He followed their movements for the rest of the war. Some of those men died on Okinawa. Some came home, but they got to fight those battles and face those risks because they hadn't been expended on a forgotten island that ultimately didn't matter. That's what Holloway's operation had bought. Not glory, not recognition, just the opportunity for those men to live a few more months. And for some of them, that few months made all the difference between coming home and being buried in a military cemetery in the Pacific. The moral questions surrounding psychological warfare operations continued to evolve after World War II. The Geneva Conventions were updated to address some aspects of information warfare, but the core tension remained unresolved. Is it acceptable to lie to enemy combatants to achieve military objectives? Where's the line between legitimate deception and perfidy? When does clever tactics become dishonorable manipulation? Different military traditions answer these questions differently. American doctrine generally accepts psychological operations as legitimate tools of warfare, provided they don't involve false surrender or misuse of protected symbols like the Red Cross. But even within American military culture, there's debate. Some officers view psychological operations as essential force multipliers. Others see them as erosion of warrior ethos. Holloway confronted this tension directly in his classified paper. He wrote, "Honor in war is a luxury purchased with blood. The more honorable the fight, the higher the casualties. I choose to be less honorable and more humane." History can judge me accordingly. Quine. That sentiment would have been controversial if the paper had been widely distributed during the Cold War. It challenged romantic notions about warfare that were deeply embedded in military culture. But by the time the paper was declassified in 2008, military doctrine had largely caught up with Holloway's position. Modern warfare accepts information operations as fundamental. The question is no longer whether to engage in psychological warfare, but how to do it effectively and within legal constraints. The veterans of the Psychological Warfare Division held occasional reunions after the war. Small gatherings, 20 or 30 men who'd worked together in that obscure corner of the military apparatus. They'd share stories over drinks, remember the successes and the failures, the operations that had worked and the ones that hadn't. And they'd toast the men who weren't there anymore. The linguists and radio operators and analysts who died in training accidents or post-war car crashes or simply from old age. Yamada attended these reunions when he could. He'd drive down from Sacramento and spend a weekend with men who understood what he'd done during the war, who knew the weight of speaking words that saved lives through deception. At one reunion in the 1980s, someone asked if he thought Target 17 had been their most successful operation. Yamada said no. The most successful operation, he thought, was one where a garrison had surrendered based on a fake radio order and nobody ever found out about it. No after-action report, no intelligence assessment, just a small island that quietly stopped fighting. That, he said, was the perfect operation, effective and completely invisible. The group laughed and moved on to other stories. But the point stood: the best intelligence operations are the ones nobody knows about, the ones that change outcomes without leaving evidence. Target 17 had been successful, but it had also been documented and studied. There were probably other operations just as effective that vanished into the classified archives and never emerged. History remembers the dramatic moments, the battles, the invasions, the turning points marked by thousands of casualties and strategic significance. It forgets the quiet victories, the prevented battles, the lives saved through cleverness rather than courage. Target 17 is remembered now because it was eventually declassified and historians found it interesting. But how many similar operations remain buried in archives? How many wars have been shaped by deceptions so successful that even the people involved didn't realize they'd been deceived? Takahashi died in 1987. His obituary in the Osaka newspaper mentioned his military service briefly. It noted he'd been a garrison commander in the Pacific who'd survived the war and returned home to teach. It didn't mention Target 17. It didn't explain that he'd surrendered his command based on fake orders. Most people at his funeral probably never knew that detail of his service. They remembered him as a teacher and a quiet man who'd done his duty during the war. But his son found a letter among his father's papers after he died. It was addressed to the American intelligence officer who gave the radio order on June 18, 1945. The letter thanked whoever had crafted that fake transmission. It explained that Takahashi had known the order was probably false, but had chosen to believe it because it gave him a way to save his men. It said that he'd spent 40 years thinking about that decision and had never regretted it. It asked that if the letter ever reached the person responsible, they should know that they'd acted with more honor than they probably realized. The son didn't know what to do with the letter. He eventually contacted the Japanese Defense Ministry, thinking they might have records about psychological operations. They didn't. The letter sat in a file for years until a researcher stumbled across it during unrelated work. That researcher tracked down Holloway, who was in his 80s by then and living in a retirement community near Berkeley. Holloway read the letter and cried. He'd spent 50 years wondering whether the men he'd deceived had felt betrayed, whether he'd dishonored them, whether the ends had truly justified the means. Takahashi's letter answered those questions. It gave him something he'd never expected: forgiveness from the man he'd tricked. He wrote a response, though Takahashi was long dead. In it, he explained the operation. He explained why they'd done it. He explained that he'd tried to be respectful even in deception, that he'd used formal language and correct protocols because he'd wanted to honor the culture even while exploiting it. He said that learning Takahashi had known the order was fake, but had used it anyway, made him realize that maybe both of them had been trying to do the same thing, find a way to stop the killing without betraying their duties. That letter is now in Holloway's archived papers at Berkeley. Next to it is Takahashi's original letter. Two men on opposite sides of a war, communicating across decades and death, reaching a kind of understanding about what they'd done and why they'd done it. It's a small detail, a footnote to a footnote, but it represents something important about how wars end and how men live with what they've done. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The lessons of Target 17 weren't fully absorbed by military doctrine until decades later. The immediate post-war period focused on technological superiority and nuclear deterrence. Psychological operations were seen as secondary tools, useful but not decisive. It took later conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, and eventually the global war on terror, to demonstrate that understanding the enemy's mind was often more important than matching their firepower. Modern special operations forces incorporate psychological operations as standard practice. Every deployment includes specialists trained in influence operations, information warfare, and cultural understanding. They study target populations. They craft messaging designed to achieve specific effects. They operate on the principle that changing behavior without violence is always preferable to kinetic action. That doctrine traces directly back to operations like Target 17, to the idea that clever deception can accomplish what bombs cannot, to the understanding that every culture has pressure points and that skilled operators can find and exploit those points without pulling a trigger. The radio operators who'd helped execute the fake broadcasts in 1945 would barely recognize their craft in modern information warfare. The technology is exponentially more sophisticated. The tactics are refined by decades of practice. But the fundamental principle remains identical. Understand your enemy well enough to make them do what you want without having to force them. Holloway recognized this during one of his consulting sessions with the military in the 1970s. He was reviewing a proposed psychological operation in Southeast Asia when he noticed the planners were focusing too heavily on technology and not enough on cultural understanding. He stopped the briefing and told them a story. He told them about Target 17, about how 3 men in a canvas tent had convinced an island to surrender, not through superior equipment, but through superior understanding. About how knowing the exact right words mattered more than having the most powerful transmitter. The planners listened politely. They were young officers who'd grown up with computers and satellites and sophisticated electronic warfare systems. The idea that cultural understanding could outweigh technological advantage seemed quaint, but one captain, younger than the others, asked Holloway to explain exactly how they'd crafted the fake message, what research had gone into it, how they'd tested the language, how they'd anticipated the target's response. Holloway spent 3 hours walking them through the process. He explained that you couldn't just translate American military communication style into another language and expect it to work. Continuar ilvem yourself, E03, that every military culture had its own communication DNA. That successful deception required understanding not just what to say, but how to say it in a way that felt authentic to the target audience. He explained that Yamada and Nakamura had been essential, not because they spoke Japanese, but because they understood how Japanese officers thought and communicated. By the end of that session, the planners were redesigning their operation. Less focus on technical sophistication, more focus on cultural authenticity, more time spent understanding the target audience, more effort put into making their messaging resonate with the values and beliefs of the people they were trying to influence. That operation, whatever it was, remains classified, but Holloway later learned it had been successful. The thank you letter he received from the commanding officer didn't provide details but noted that his insights had directly contributed to achieving objectives without casualties. That was enough for him. The strange career of psychological warfare continues to evolve. Modern conflicts are increasingly fought in information space as much as physical space. Adversaries use social media, hacked communications, and sophisticated propaganda to achieve strategic goals without firing shots. The fake radio broadcast that convinced Target 17 to surrender looks primitive compared to modern capabilities, but the underlying principle remains the same. Make your enemy do what you want by understanding and exploiting how they think. Whether that's ethical remains an open question. Military ethicists still debate where the line falls between legitimate deception and immoral manipulation. International law provides some boundaries but leaves vast gray areas. And the people actually executing these operations, the modern descendants of Holloway, Yamada, and Nakamura, still wrestle with the same questions. Is it right to lie to achieve military objectives? When does cleverness become dishonor? How do you live with the knowledge that you've manipulated people into making decisions they wouldn't have made with complete information? There are no clean answers. Warfare itself is morally complicated. Adding deception just makes it more complicated. But the alternative, resolving every conflict through pure violence, produces its own moral costs. The 100 Marines who didn't die on Target 17's beaches represent the strongest argument for psychological operations. They represent lives saved through understanding rather than firepower. Webb, Holloway, Yamada, Nakamura, and Takahashi are all gone now. Their story survives in declassified documents and archived letters, and the memories of a few historians who've studied that obscure corner of the Pacific War. It's not a famous story. There are no movies about it, no dramatic monuments, just a handful of men who figured out how to win a battle without fighting it, and saved lives in the process. That quiet victory matters more than most dramatic ones. It represents the possibility that warfare doesn't always have to be brutal, that intelligence and understanding can sometimes substitute for violence, that the cleverest victories are often the ones where nobody dies. In the end, that's what Target 17 teaches us, not that deception is noble or that trickery is honorable, but that, in the terrible calculus of war, the strategy that saves the most lives is the one worth choosing, even if history never celebrates it, even if it requires moral compromises that keep you awake at night, even if the only reward is knowing that somewhere, men who would have died got to go home instead. That's not glory. That's just mathematics. The mathematics of prevented tragedy. The arithmetic of choosing between imperfect options and accepting the weight of that choice. Webb made that choice when he authorized the operation. Holloway made it when he conceived the plan. Yamada and Nakamura made it when they spoke those careful words into a microphone. Takahashi made it when he chose to believe orders he suspected were false. Each of them carried the weight of that decision for the rest of their lives. Each of them wondered whether they'd done the right thing, whether the compromises were justified, whether the lives saved balanced against the honor sacrificed. There's no objective answer to those questions. Just individual men making impossible choices in circumstances where every option involved moral cost. But the 100 Marines who didn't die that day would probably say it was worth it. The Japanese soldiers who surrendered and went home after the war would probably say it was worth it. And 50 years later, when Takahashi wrote his letter thanking the unknown American officer who'd given him away to save his men, he was saying, it was worth it. That's as close to vindication as anyone gets in war. Not glory, not honor. Just the knowledge that when faced with impossible choices, you chose the option that led to fewer mothers crying, fewer fathers getting telegrams, fewer lives ending on forgotten beaches for forgotten objectives. The radio that broadcast those fake orders sits in a Smithsonian warehouse. The island where it all happened is forgotten by everyone except a handful of historians. The men who made it happen are all gone. But the principle survives. The understanding that wars are fought in minds as much as on battlefields. That the smartest commanders are the ones who figure out how to win without fighting. That sometimes the greatest courage is the courage to be clever instead of brave. That's the legacy of Target 17. Not a monument or a medal, just an idea. The idea that understanding your enemy well enough to make them do what you want without violence is the highest form of military skill. The idea that honor in war isn't about fighting cleanly, it's about ending the fighting as quickly as possible with minimum loss of life. The idea that the best victory is the one where everyone gets to go home. 3 men spoke into a microphone for 90 seconds. An island surrendered, lives were saved, and somewhere in the endless archives of World War II, that small story waits for anyone willing to listen. Waits to remind us that the most important battles are sometimes the ones that never get fought, that the greatest victories are sometimes the ones nobody celebrates, and that in the terrible business of war, the real heroes are often the ones who figure out how to make the killing stop.